All right, everyone. Perhaps you've noticed that the reading schedule for this particular chapter is short. That is for good reason, because we are having our very first unit exam of the entire year on next Monday. So next Monday um, will be the summative assessment for quarter two, basically the final exam, only instead of being at the end of quarter two, it'll be kind of right at the beginning. It will cover pretty much everything we've learned so far. Probably just going to do multiple choice for right now. We might do a comparative essay, um, be summative, sort of closer to Christmas. But um, yeah, so anyway, make sure that you plan for next Monday to be your class will be about an hour. So instead of the typical 45 minutes, it'll be an hour to give time for the full unit exam. So to this week, we just a couple um, like subsections of chapter six. We will not be reading the entire chapter six. We're just going to be focusing on some of the bigger civilizations as they relate to the next unit. So here we go. Let's dive right in. First one, let's do kind of a big picture overview. This particular chapter is what I would call kind of a loose threads chapter. Strayer oftentimes does them at the end of the unit, which is basically making sure that you are following sort of the storylines in some of the out of maybe out of focus areas. And so obviously in this particular chapter we looked at um, the Mediterranean with Rome and Greece. Oh, excuse me. And we looked at Han China and Qin, and we looked at kind of the Middle East. But now we want to kind of look at sort of the other parts of the world that weren't focused on in this classical era civilizations. And so when we talk about civilizations as they've arose in different parts of the world, obviously there's a bunch of really important differences. And when we talk about the Americas, which thus far we've been really light on, we need to kind of first acknowledge one of the big fundamental differences between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia, which is just that geographic luck argument that Jared Diamond made in Guns, Germs, and Steel last year, right? That the Americas lacked the right crops, they lacked domesticatable animals, and as a result of that, right, they tended to be further behind the development train. Africa had previously imported domesticated animals um, that have crossed the Sahara by this point, and so cattle and goats and sheep and whatnot are kind of down all the way covering south like sub-Saharan Africa. But the Americas, the only domesticatable animal in the Americas is the llama, right? And so this had a pretty large impact on specialization of jobs. We know that animals not only provide kind of a stable protein source, but their manure and their labor that they can perform on the farm allows for much larger food production involving much less people. So when you don't have the animals to do a lot of the farm work for you and fertilize it, then there's less ability for other people to pursue other job specialization areas. And so we look at in the Americas compared to Afro-Eurasia in the classical era, and we see that metallurgy is far less developed. Now, metallurgy obviously being metalworking, and so whereas Afro-Eurasia in the civilization in the classical era has really moved on to iron weapons. The Americas are still kind of using bronze and various other metals that are much heavier. Um, Also, significant impact on the writing and the lack of a written language. Generally speaking, um, the only place you found a written language in the Americas was in Central America, um, with the Mayan codex, and the Aztecs had a written language. Um, but the Andean mountain civilizations and then the civilizations of North America up around Cahokia, they did not either. In Africa, it was generally confined to the north. Excuse me, in the northeast, kind of down that side. But we definitely saw, compared to the Middle East and East Asia and South Asia and India, and the Mediterranean, we definitely saw fewer big civilizations in the Americas and in Africa, right? Africa definitely was in close contact with Eurasia. There was the Trans-Saharan trade networks, which we're going to be looking at in the next unit, beginning to kind of blossom and develop in this part of the world. And so they were definitely in contact with Eurasia. But the Americas obviously were completely cut off, right? We don't start talking about a global trade network or a truly globalized, connected world until after, really around period four when Columbus kind of rolls into the New World in 1492, and suddenly the Americas are linked. But prior to that, the Americas are completely cut off. Um, Africa is integrated into not only the Mediterranean zone, right, with like Egypt and North Africa being connected to what's going on in Europe, but also connecting in through the Middle East. Um, we also saw coming out of the Arabian Peninsula. So if you close your eyes and you think of Saudi Arabia on a map, that Saudi Arabian Peninsula is just a short hop, skip, and a jump away from the eastern coast of Africa across the Red Sea. I guess what I'm saying here is that Africa is now pretty much fully integrated into the Eurasian trade routes, whereas America obviously not. And so let's take a look specifically at some of the civilizations in the Americas, kind of um, track. We looked at the Olmecs briefly in a previous chapter. We're now looking at how some of the Olmec civilizations sort of have grown or progressed rather until we have a new civilization known as the Mayan. And so when we talk about the Mayan civilization, we are talking about a civilization that arose in what is today the very southern tip of Mexico, the Yucatan, and into Guatemala. And we started to see historians kind of finding and archaeologists finding evidence of a kind of a developing civilization in the Yucatan and in the Mayan civilization lands around 2000 BCE. So that's a really old civilization, right? Getting closer to the Indus River Valley in Shang, China. And what's interesting, right, is that even though there aren't Mayan cities anymore, and there's not a Mayan um, you know, state anywhere. In that particular part of southern Mexico and Central America, the Mayan language and culture is actually still pretty strong, right? And so if you go down into Oaxaca and into Guatemala and the Yucatan, right, there's over 6 million people in that region who still self-identify as Mayans, speak the language, kind of maintaining Mayans culture. Um, Yet, as we look at what happened to the Mayan civilization, it's a tale of culture and language surviving in the absence of a civilization because, when we look at the Mayan civilization, it was really, as if it began in 2000 BCE, it really hit its golden age, its classical phase, kind of when it was at its peak from 250 to 900 CE. And so, putting that into context, that is um, after the Roman Empire, when most of Western Europe has fallen. It is around the time of the rise of Islam in the Middle East, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. But this Mayan civilization that arose, and when we saw the Golden Age, the Classical Age, it was enormously productive and very advanced in a lot of ways. Advanced mathematics. Some of you might remember 5 years ago when the Mayan calendar predicted the end of the world, but the Mayan calendars were incredibly precise for all the way until recently. Honestly, they were still predicting modern day eclipses that were calculated by Mayan astronomers 2,000 years earlier. It had a writing system, huge building projects, um, most famously for their big giant step pyramids that we're going to look at. And the Mayan economy was one of large scale work projects organized by the Mayan city states themselves, right? And so using slaves and human engineering to take what was obviously a jungly, wet part of the world and turn it into a productive agricultural area, right? Draining swamps, terracing the sides of this particular part of the world is pretty volcanic, and so there was a lot of big volcanoes, terracing the sides of those to use the rich volcanic soil, but obviously minimize erosion. Remember, terracing is the step farming that we saw in previous chapters. Water management system, And all of this kind of gave rise to the same thing in the Mayan civilization that you saw in China, right, in India, right? The arising of an elite class, of a social hierarchy that was clearly separated, along with an artisan class. And so looking at it here, here is on a map, you can see it does kind of touch into El Salvador and Honduras, but it really is kind of that Yucatan region where you can see all these three dots are Mayan ruins, down into Guatemala, and in kind of not quite to the Oaxaca in the west, but that those Mexican state of like Chiapas. And so as we look, let's continue. What's most interesting, perhaps politically, about the Mayan civilization is that I haven't used the word empire, right? And this is very similar to the Greeks, right? And so there's a lot of metaphors, or not metaphors, but comparison points to be made between the Greek civilization and the Mayan, right? Because prior to Alexander, there was a part of the Mediterranean that was definitely Greek, unified by Greek culture, Greek language, the Greek religion, but no Greek empire. Instead, you had Greek city states in competition with each other, right? And that was Athens and Sparta and Troy and Thebes and Corinth and all these Greek city-states that were common. No Greek empire, but definitely a Greek civilization, and that's a metaphor to the Mayans, right? It was a like highly fragmented group of Mayan city-states that frequently warred with each other, captured each other as prisoners, and then used them as human sacrifice to appease the gods and make sure the sun came up every day. And I'm kind of blending here. That's really an Aztec tradition, but human sacrifice to the gods was a big part of the Mayan religion as well. They lived in densely populated urban centers. There were, thriving Mayan cities in this particular part of the world, of southern Mexico. And we think that like the Indus River Valley, these urban centers, these Mayan cities, would have been ruled by sort of a priest class, these state shamans, or religious figures who could kind of mediate with the divine and would preside over the large scale human sacrificing and rituals to kind of keep um, the gods happy. Now, just like pre-Alexander Greece, the Mayan city-states never unified. They never succeeded in creating an actual Mayan empire. There was multiple Mayan city-states, but none of them ever got strong enough to really just take over all the others. And perhaps what's most interesting, and this is an interesting contrast to what I said earlier with the fact that there's still, 6 million people in the world today who identify as Mayan, is that the Mayan civilization actually experienced a rather startling collapse almost 1,200 years ago, where the Mayan civilization just basically disappeared. The cities people walked away from, the jungle came in and took them back over. And archaeologists have wrestled with this idea of what the heck happened? How do you have a thriving, densely populated, city-driven, city-state organized civilization with all the advanced mathematics and technology it created and just have it just disappear? And the predominant theory here of what kind of brought the Mayan civilization to an end was a drought that lasted almost 100 years. A long-term drought in this part of the world radically shifted the agricultural economy and basically led to famine and economic collapse. And over this 100 years, there is evidence based off of burial sites and the size of cities and various different like trash resources that we look at, that Mayan population dropped by almost 85%. So that's like not something that's a small thing. That's like a legit like holy crap, what just happened? Like zombie apocalypse style collapse. Um, Yet even still, obviously, like I said, the Mayan culture survives, but their cities did not, right? And so we know that the drought played an enormous part of it, but the drought probably alone wouldn't have destroyed the Mayan civilization if not for the fact that they basically got too successful, right? Their farming got too good, their population got too much, and so by 600 CE, about 240 years before they ended up collapsing, they had kind of outperformed what was available to them.